Imagine stepping into your backyard on a freezing winter morning, only to discover a heartbreaking sight: a German shepherd emaciated and frozen, lying unconscious in the snow. His body is motionless, his fur covered in frost, and the bitter wind whips around him mercilessly. Though his eyes are closed, there's a silent plea for help etched into his fragile form. What started as a simple act of compassion quickly unfolds into a mystery. Who is this dog? Why is he here? And what the man uncovers next will leave you speechless. It was one of the coldest mornings of the year, with temperatures plummeting below freezing. David Carter, a 38-year-old carpenter with rugged features and a kind heart, bundled himself in his heavy coat before stepping out into his backyard. Snow blanketed everything in sight, muffling the world around him. The quiet was almost peaceful, until he noticed something unusual. At first, he thought it was a pile of snow, or perhaps a fallen branch, but as he walked closer, his breath caught in his chest. Lying motionless in the snow was a large German shepherd, his body coated in frost and his fur clumped with ice. "Oh, my God!" David muttered, rushing toward the dog. He crouched beside the animal, his hands trembling as he gently touched its side. The fur was icy cold, and for a moment David feared the worst, but then he felt a faint rise and fall of the dog's chest. "He's alive!" David whispered, a surge of adrenaline rushing through him without hesitation. He removed his coat and wrapped it around the dog's frail body. The dog didn't move. His eyes shut tight and his breathing shallow. David lifted the dog carefully, cradling him in his arms as he trudged back toward the house. The weight of the animal, combined with the thick snow, made the journey difficult, but David refused to stop. "You're going to be okay," he said, more to himself than to the dog inside the house. David laid the dog on a thick blanket near the fireplace. He quickly lit the fire, the warmth spreading through the room. Almost instantly grabbing towels, he began gently drying the dog's fur, careful not to disturb the animal's fragile state. The dog remained unresponsive, his body limp and his fur still cold to the touch. David's mind raced. Who did this? Dog belonged to? Why was he in the backyard? And how long had he been out in the snow? "Hang in there, buddy," David said softly, his voice tinged with urgency. He grabbed his phone and dialed the local veterinarian. "Hi, Dr. Owens. I found a dog in my backyard. He's barely alive. Can you help Dr. Owens?" A calm and experienced veterinarian responded quickly. "Wrap him in blankets and bring him here as soon as possible. Keep him warm, but don't try to feed him. Yet his body might be too weak to handle it." David nodded, even though the vet couldn't see him. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Wrapping the dog in another 10 minutes. Blanket David carried him to his truck, careful to keep him as warm as possible. The drive to the clinic felt like an eternity, each bump in the road making David wince as he glanced at the still unconscious dog in the passenger seat. When he arrived, the veterinary team was waiting. Dr. Owens, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, immediately assessed the situation. "He's hypothermic and severely malnourished," she said. "As they carried the dog inside, we'll need to stabilize him first. It's going to take time." David stood by anxiously as the team worked. They inserted an IV, applied warming pads, and monitored the dog's vitals closely. Dr. Owens explained that the next 24 hours would be critical. "HEK, a fighter," she said, glancing at David. "But he's in rough shape. Do you have any idea where he came from?" David shook his head. "No clue. He just showed up in my backyard this morning. I didn't see a collar or anything." Dr. Owens nodded thoughtfully. "We'll check for a microchip once he's stable. But for now, it's all about getting him through the night as the hours passed. David refused to leave. He sat in the waiting room replaying the moment he found the dog over and over in his mind. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him. This wasn't just a stray dog. Something had happened late that evening. Dr. Owens emerged from the treatment room he's stable for now. She said, her voice cautious but hopeful. "We've got him warmed up and his vitals are improving. He's not out of the woods yet, but it's a good start." Relief washed over David as he let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Can I see him?" Dr. Owens hesitated, then nodded, just for a moment. "He needs rest." David entered the treatment room and approached the dog who was now lying on a heated pad. His chest rose and fell steadily. And though his eyes were still closed, there was a faint flicker of life in his expression. "You're a tough one," David said softly, kneeling beside him. "We're going to get through this, okay? You're safe now." For the first time, David felt a connection with the dog, a sense that their paths had crossed for a reason. But as he looked closer, he noticed something odd, a faint scar on the dog's side barely visible under the fur. It looked deliberate, as though it had been made by human hands. "What happened to you?" "You," David murmured, his curiosity deepening. Little did he know the answers he sought would change everything the morning after. David discovered the German Shepherd. The world outside his window was still blanketed in snow, the bitter chill refusing to relent inside. However, the house was warm and David sat by the fireplace, sipping coffee, while glancing occasionally at his phone. He had barely slept, his mind consumed with worry for the dog he had found. Dr. Owens had promised to call with updates, but the wait felt unbearable. David couldn't shake the image of the dog lying in the snow, frozen and lifeless. And then there was that scar, a thin, deliberate mark on the dog's side. It nodded at him, a clue that hinted at something sinister. Finally, his phone buzzed and he answered it immediately. "Dr. Owens," her calm voice came through the line. "Good news. David the dog made it through the night. He's still weak, but he's stable enough for us to run a few tests. We also scanned for a microchip, and we found one." David sat up straighter. "You did? What did it say, Dr. Owens?" Hesitated. "The chip is registered, but there's something strange about it. The information leads to an address about 30 miles from here, but the name associated with it doesn't match any records in our system. I've already contacted Animal Control and the local authorities to help investigate." David's brow furrowed. "What do you mean by strange? Is it fake?" "It's hard to say," she admitted, "but it's not typical. We're still looking into it." David thanked her and hung up his thoughts racing. He couldn't sit idle any longer. Grabbing his coat, he decided to head back to his backyard, hoping to find any additional clues about where the dog had come from or how he had ended up there. The snow crunched under his boots as he retraced his steps. From the day before, the spot where the dog had been lying was still visible, a shallow impression in the snow surrounded by scattered frost. But something caught his eye, a faint trail leading away from the spot, partially covered by fresh snowfall. David followed the trail, his heart pounding as he walked it. Led to the edge of his property, near a low fence that bordered a patch of dense woods. The tracks were uneven, as though the dog had stumbled or been dragged as David scanned the area. He noticed something half buried in the snow. He crouched down and brushed it off, revealing a torn piece of fabric, a scrap from what looked like a dark jacket. The edges were braid, and there were faint stains on it that made his stomach tighten. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, turning the fabric over in his hands. He looked around his instincts as a former army medic, kicking in. This wasn't just a random stray dog wandering into his yard. Someone or something had brought the dog here, and the evidence was piling up. David returned to the house, the fabric clutched tightly in his hand. He called Dr. Owens again, sharing what he had found. That's definitely unusual. She said the authorities should know about this. If you can bring it by the clinic, I'll make sure they get it. David agreed and drove to the clinic, the fabric sitting on the passenger seat beside him. When he arrived, Dr. Owens met him in the lobby, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "We've also run some blood work on the dog," she said as they walked to her office. "There are elevated stress markers, and his malnourished state suggests he's been neglected for weeks, if not longer." "But the scar?" She paused, pulling up a photo on her tablet. "It looks surgical, almost like an implant or some kind of procedure." David's jaw tightened. Why would someone do that to a dog? "That's what we're trying to figure out," she said. "It's possible the authorities will want to examine him further, but for now, we're focusing on his recovery." David visited the dog again, who was now lying comfortably on a padded bed in the treatment area. His breathing was steady, and his eyes opened slightly as David approached. "Hey, buddy," David said softly, kneeling beside Himu. "A tough one, aren't you?" The dog's tail twitched faintly and David smiled. "Despite the weight of his questions, we're going to figure this out. Whoever did this to you, they're not getting away with it." As David left the clinic that day, the pieces of the puzzle swirled in his mind. The mysterious scar, the torn fabric, the strange microchip. One thing was clear. This was no ordinary rescue. And the truth, when he uncovered it, would be more shocking than he could ever imagine. The drive home from the clinic was quiet, but David's thoughts were anything but the scraps of evidence. The scar, the strange microchip, and the torn fabric felt like pieces of a dark puzzle waiting to be solved as much as he wanted to focus on the dog's recovery. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something sinister at play. That evening, David sat at his kitchen table, fabric spread out in front of him. He noticed faint stitching along the edge, almost like it had been ripped from a jacket or uniform. The fabric was sturdy, not the kind you'd find on everyday clothing, and then there were the stains, reddish-brown, and unmistakably blood. David sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Who are you, buddy?" he muttered, glancing toward the fireplace where the dog's empty bed awaited his return. Unable to ignore the mystery, David decided to call an old friend, Ethan Hayes, a detective with the local police department. Ethan and David had served together in the military years ago, and while they had drifted apart, their bond remained strong. "Ethan, it's David," he said when the line connected. "David Carter." Ethan replied, his voice warm but cautious. "It's been a while. What's going on?" David explained everything: the dog, the scar, the fabric, and the unsettling details about the microchip. Ethan listened carefully, his tone growing more serious with each passing detail. "That's unusual," Ethan said finally. "A surgical scar and a fake microchip, that's not something we see every day. And you said the dog was malnourished and left out in the snow." "Yeah," David said. "It doesn't add up. Do you think you can look into the chip and see if it's connected to anything?" "I'll see what I can find." Ethan said in the meantime, "Keep me updated and be careful." "David, if someone dumped that dog, they might not want him found." David thanked Ethan and hung up a cold knot forming in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than a simple case of neglect. The next morning, Dr. Owens called with another update. "The dog is doing better," she said. "He's alert and responding well to treatment. If things continue to improve, you might be able to take him home in a day or two." That's great news, David said, relief washing over him. There's something else, Dr. Owens added. The authorities traced the microchip to a company that specializes in animal testing. It's unclear what kind of testing, but they flagged the address for further investigation. David's heart sank. Animal testing. Are you saying he might have been experimented on? It's possible, Dr. Owens said gently, but we don't know for sure. Yet the scar could be related to a procedure. But it's also possible he escaped from somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. The thought of the dog enduring any kind of suffering made David's blood boil. He resolved to do whatever it took to ensure the dog's safety and to find out the truth. Later that afternoon, David returned to the clinic. When he entered the recovery room, the dog lifted his head slightly, his amber eyes meeting David's with a spark of recognition. "Hey there, buddy," David said softly, kneeling beside him. The dog's tail wagged faintly, a small but significant sign of trust. Dr. Owens joined them, holding a clipboard. "We've started calling him Ranger," she said with a smile. "Ranger," David repeated, nodding. "It suits him." As David stroked Ranger's head, he couldn't help but notice how the dog's demeanor had changed, though still weak. There was a quiet strength in his eyes, a resilience that mirrored David's own determination to uncover the truth. Dr. Owens cleared her throat. "David, there's one more thing. I didn't mention it over the phone, because I didn't want to alarm you, but someone came by the clinic last night asking about the dog." David froze. "What, who?" "A man. He didn't leave a name, but he seemed very interested in whether the dog had been brought here. He left when we didn't give him any information, but it was strange. I thought you should know." David's jaw tightened. "Did you get a description?" Dr. Owens nodded. "Mid-40 tall, wearing a dark coat and gloves. He seemed off, like he was hiding something." David felt his pulse quicken. Someone was looking for Ranger, and not for a good reason. "Thanks for telling me," he said. "If he comes back, call me immediately that evening." As David prepared to leave the clinic, he made a silent vow whoever was after Ranger would have to go through him. First, this dog had already suffered enough, and David wasn't about to let anything or anyone hurt him again. As he drove home, Ranger's scar and the torn fabric weighed heavily on his mind. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the picture they painted was dark, and foreboding. David knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The next morning, David stood in his backyard staring at the patch of snow where he had first found Ranger. The image of the emaciated dog lying lifeless in the cold was still fresh in his mind. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone had left Ranger there on purpose. The discovery of the scar, the fake microchip, and Dr. Owens' warning about the stranger who had visited the clinic only deepened his concern. David decided to set up a camera near the fence, where the trail of tracks had led into the woods. If someone came back, he wanted to be ready. He installed the motion-activated camera high on a tree, and tested it to ensure it covered the area thoroughly. Later that day, Dr. Owens called again. "Ranger is well enough to go home with you," she said, "but I need you to keep a close eye on him. He's still recovering and needs plenty of rest." David felt a mix of relief and responsibility. "I'll take good care of him," he promised by the afternoon. Ranger was back at David's house, resting on a thick blanket near the fireplace. His eyes were more alert now, following David's movements around the room. Occasionally, his tail would thump softly against the floor, a sign of growing trust. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" David said, kneeling beside him. "But you're safe now. No one's going to hurt you again." That evening, As the sun set and the cold crept back in, David prepared dinner for himself and Ranger. The dog ate slowly but eagerly, his body regaining strength with every bite for the first time since finding him. David allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope, but the peace didn't last long. Around midnight, David was jolted awake by the sound of his motion-activated camera. Alerting his phone, groggy but alarmed, he grabbed his phone and opened the app. The live feed showed a dark figure near the fence at the edge of his property. "What the hell?" David muttered, his heart racing. The figure appeared to be searching for something, their movements cautious but deliberate. David grabbed a flashlight and his old baseball bat, throwing on his coat as he headed outside. Ranger, now alert, followed him to the door, letting out a low growl. "Stay here, buddy," David said gently, closing the door behind him. The snow crunched under David's boots as he approached the fence. He shone his flashlight toward the figure, who froze at the sudden light. "Hey," David shouted, "what are you doing here?" The figure bolted, disappearing into the woods before David could get a good look. Frustrated, he searched the area but found nothing out of place. Back inside, Ranger greeted him with a wagging tail, but his growl had shifted to a quiet whine, as if sensing something was wrong. David knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "Someone's looking for you, huh?" he murmured. "Well, they're not getting you, not on my watch." The next day, David called Ethan to report the incident. "I couldn't see his face," David explained. But whoever it was, they weren't just wandering around. They were looking for something or someone. Ethan's voice was firm. "Keep your doors locked and stay vigilant. I'll see if I can send someone to patrol the area tonight by the evening." David had secured the house, double-checking every lock and window. Ranger seemed more at ease, lying by the fire with his head on his paws. But David couldn't shake the feeling that their safety was temporary around midnight. The motion camera alerted him again. This time, David didn't hesitate. He grabbed his bat and flashlight, opening the app as he moved toward the bee backyard. The feed showed the same dark figure, this time closer to the house. David stepped outside the flashlight, cutting through the darkness. "Whoever you are, you better leave now," he yelled. The figure hesitated before disappearing into the woods once more, but this time, David noticed something they had left behind near the fence, a piece of paper fluttering in the wind. He approached cautiously, picking up the paper and unfolding it. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words scrawled across it. "You don't know what you've got hand over the dog, or you'll regret it." David's grip tightened on the paper, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to intimidate him. He returned to the house, where Ranger greeted him with a wagging tail and curious eyes. David knelt beside him, holding the note in one hand and stroking the dog's head with the other. "They're not getting you," David said softly, his voice steady with resolve. "I don't know what they want, but I'm going to find out, and I'm not letting them hurt you again." As Ranger leaned into his touch, David made a silent vow. Whoever was behind this, they had underestimated him, and they were about to learn just how far he would go to protect his new companion. The chilling note left near the fence haunted David. Who were these people? And why were they so desperate to get Ranger back? The scar, the microchip, the stranger at the clinic, it all pointed to something far darker than David had initially imagined that morning. He called Ethan, again recounting the events of the previous night and describing the note in detail. "You're right to be worried," Ethan said gravely. "This is no coincidence. I've been digging into that microchip you mentioned, and I found something disturbing." David leaned forward in his chair, gripping his phone tightly. "What did you find?" The microchip isn't registered to a standard pet database. It's linked to a private lab that operates just outside the city. Ethan explained the lab claims to focus on advanced veterinary medicine, but there have been rumors, unofficial reports of unethical testing, including experiments on rescue animals. It's all very hush-hush, and they've managed to keep it out of the public eye. David's stomach churned. You think Ranger was part of those experiments? It's possible. Ethan replied, the scar you mentioned could indicate an implant or some other invasive procedure. If Ranger escaped, they might see him as a liability. A loose end they need to tie up. David's blood boiled at the thought not getting him back. He said firmly, I didn't think you'd let them. Ethan said with a slight chuckle, Listen, I'll see if I can dig up more on this lab. In the meantime, keep that note safe and stay alert. These people won't stop easily after hanging up. David glanced at Ranger, who was lying by the fire, his ears twitching as he dozed. The dog's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions. Brewing inside David, he couldn't let Ranger go back to whoever had hurt him, but he also couldn't ignore the danger they both faced. David spent the afternoon preparing. He reinforced the locks on his doors, set up additional cameras around the property, and even boarded up the windows in the back of the house. By the time the sun set, he was confident that his home was as secure as it could be. That night, David stayed up late, keeping watch. By the window, Ranger sat beside him, his amber eyes scanning the dark yard, as if he too was on high alert hours. Passed in silence until just after midnight, David's phone buzzed with another motion alert. He opened the app and saw two figures near the fence. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by masks. One of them held a crowbar, while the other carried a flashlight scanning the yard as they moved closer to the house. David's pulse quickened. Stay here, he whispered to Ranger, though he doubted the dog would listen, grabbing his bat. David stepped outside, keeping to the shadows as he approached the intruders. Hey! He shouted, his voice cutting through the still night. The men froze, their flashlights swinging toward him. This doesn't concern you, one of them said, his voice low and threatening. It does when you're trespassing on my property. David shot back. I don't know who you are, but you're not taking the dog. The man with the crowbar took a step forward. You don't understand. That dog isn't yours. He belongs to us. David tightened his grip on the bat he belongs to. No one, not anymore. The tension in the air was palpable as the two men exchanged glances. Then, without warning, the man with the crowbar lunged at David. David sidestepped the attack, swinging the bat and striking the man's arm. He cried out, dropping the crowbar as he stumbled back. The second man rushed forward. But before he could reach David, a deep growl echoed through the yard. Ranger charged from the house, his powerful body cutting through the darkness like a missile. He leapt at the second man, knocking him to the ground with a ferocious bark. David quickly grabbed the crowbar, pointing it at the first man. Get out of here, he growled, and if you come back, you'll regret it. The two men scrambled to their feet, retreating toward the fence. Ranger stood his ground, his growl low and menacing, as he watched them disappear here into the woods. David dropped the crowbar and knelt beside Ranger, his hands shaking as he stroked the dog's head. Good boy, he said softly. You're a damn good boy. Back inside. David locked the doors and collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but grateful. Ranger lay beside him, his eyes alert but calm. You saved me tonight, David said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what they did to you before, but you're not just a fighter, you're a hero. As Ranger rested his head on David's lap, a new determination took hold of him. Whoever those men were, they had underestimated him, and they had underestimated Ranger together. They would uncover the truth and put an end to whatever dark secrets were hiding in that lab. The following morning, David woke with a renewed sense of urgency. Events of the previous night, Ranger's bravery, the trespassers, and their ominous claim that the dog belonged to them, fueled his determination to uncover the truth. He had to find out what had been done to Ranger and put an end to whatever dark operation the lab was running. David called Ethan again, recounting the confrontation with the intruders. These people aren't going to stop. David said they're desperate to get Ranger back. What did you find out about that lab? Ethan sighed. It's worse than I thought. The lab operates under the name Xenotech Research, and while they claim to specialize in veterinary advancements, there are whistleblower reports suggesting illegal experimentation, genetic modifications, behavioral conditioning. You name it, and get this, the address associated with the microchip matches one of their closed facilities. It shut down months ago, but it looks like they're still operating in the shadows. David clenched his jaw, so they've been using dogs like Ranger for their experiments. Most likely. Ethan confirmed Ranger probably escaped during the shutdown, but they want him back, because he's evidence of their illegal activity. If you want to take them on, you'll need proof, something solid to expose them. David nodded his mind, already. Racing, how do I get into the lab? I wouldn't recommend going in alone, Ethan warned. But if you're determined, I can get you the blueprints and any additional intel. Just be careful. David, these people are dangerous. Later that afternoon, Ethan sent David the blueprints to the lab. The facility was located on the outskirts of town, hidden in a wooded area. David studied the maps, formulating a plan. He wasn't sure what he would find inside, but he knew he couldn't let Ranger's suffering be in vain. That night, David loaded his truck with supplies, a flashlight, a crowbar, and a camera to document anything he found. Ranger watched him silently, his amber eyes filled with understanding. "You're staying here, buddy," David said, kneeling beside him. "I need you safe. If anything happens to me, you'll need to protect yourself." Ranger let out a low whine, but didn't protest. David gave him a reassuring pat before locking the house and driving toward the lab. The facility was exactly as Ethan had described. Run down and surrounded by dense trees, the chain-link fence around the property was rusty, and the no trespassing signs were faded and barely visible. David parked his truck a safe distance away and approached on foot, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The main entrance was locked, but David found a side door that had been forced open, likely by the same people who had been searching for Ranger. He slipped inside his flashlight, illuminating a long, sterile hallway. The air inside was heavy with the smell of chemicals and decay. Broken equipment and scattered papers littered the floor, and the walls were lined with empty cages, too small for any animal to live in comfortably. David's stomach churned as he moved deeper into the facility. He took pictures of everything: the cages, the shattered vials, and the faded documents left behind. But it wasn't until he entered a back room that he found the evidence he needed. The room was filled with medical equipment, much of it still functional. On a table in the center of the room was a series of files, each labeled with a number. David opened one and froze inside were detailed notes on Ranger, complete with photographs of his surgery subject 472. The file read, "Implantation of tracking device and behavioral modification test. Successful results indicate enhanced tracking ability, but increased aggression. David's hands shook as he read the report they had experimented on Ranger altering his body and mind for their purposes. He flipped through the pages, finding references to other animals that hadn't survived the experiments. "These monsters," he muttered, snapping photos of every page. Just as he finished, he heard voices echoing down the hall. His heart raced as he quickly turned off his flashlight and hid behind a stack of equipment. "You said the dog's owner might come here." One voice said, "I'm telling you, he'll try to find out the truth." Another replied, "We need to clean this place out before he brings the cops." David held his breath as the men entered the room, their flashlights sweeping the area. One of them paused near the files, muttering curses under his breath, "Pack everything up." The man ordered, "And destroy anything we can't carry. No one can know about this." As the men began gathering the evidence, David slipped out of the room, his pulse pounding in his ears. He made his way back to the side door, careful to avoid detection. Once outside, he ran toward the woods. His camera and the horrifying knowledge of what Ranger had endured clutched tightly in his hands. When David returned home, Ranger greeted him with a wagging tail, but David couldn't bring himself to smile. He knelt beside the dog, his voice trembling as he said, "They did horrible things to you, but we're going to make sure they pay. I promise." David couldn't sleep that night. The images he had captured at the lab, the cold clinical notes about Ranger's modifications, and the voices of the men planning to cover up their crimes played on a loop in his mind. He knew time was running out. The people responsible for Ranger's suffering wouldn't hesitate to destroy the evidence and silence anyone who got in their way. The next morning, David called Ethan and explained everything he had found at the lab. He sent over the photos files, and his account of what he had overheard. Ethan's silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "This is worse than I imagined," Ethan finally said. "These people aren't just experimenting on animals. They're running an illegal operation. If what you've shown me checks out, we have enough to get a warrant and shut them down." "Then let him do it," David said firmly. Ethan hesitated. "David, these people are dangerous. They'll do anything to protect their operation. You need to be careful." David glanced at Ranger, who was lying at his feet, his amber eyes watching him closely. "I don't care how dangerous they are. I'm not letting them hurt anyone else." Within hours, Ethan had mobilized a task force to raid the lab. David insisted on being there, and though Ethan was reluctant, he eventually agreed, as the convoy of police vehicles made its way toward the lab. That evening, David sat in the passenger seat of Ethan's car, his heart pounding. Ranger was in the back seat, his ears perked up and his tail wagging faintly, as though he sensed the importance of the mission when they arrived. The officers surrounded the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Ethan gave the signal, and the team moved in. David stayed outside with Ranger watching as the officers breached the facility. The next few minutes were a blur of shouts, commands, and the clatter of equipment being seized. Several men were let out in handcuffs, their faces hard with anger and frustration. Ethan emerged shortly after holding a stack of documents. "We've got everything we need," he said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Files, equipment, even some video footage. These guys won't be able to hide from this." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. What about the animals? Were there any others? Ethan's expression softened. No animals were left behind, but there are reports of others who didn't survive. Ranger, one of the lucky ones. David nodded, his throat tightening. He knelt beside Ranger, scratching behind his ears. "You're not just lucky, buddy. You're a survivor." The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and media coverage. The lab's operation was exposed, and the individuals responsible faced charges ranging from animal cruelty to illegal experimentation. Ranger became a symbol of resilience. His story inspired countless people to take a stand against animal abuse. David was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. People from all over the community reached out offering donations and resources to help care for Ranger and other animals in need. But for David, the most important thing was that Ranger was finally safe one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. David reflected on how much had changed since that fateful morning. Ranger lay beside him, his coat glossy, and his scars now faint, reminders of a dark past you've been through so much. David said softly, his hand resting on Ranger's head, "But you never gave up, and because of you, so many others will never have to suffer the way you did." Ranger wagged his tail, his amber eyes meeting David's with a look of unwavering trust in that moment. David knew they had both found something they had been missing: family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, David smiled. "We are a team now, buddy, and no matter what happens, I'll always have your back, just like you had mine." Ranger let out a contented huff, resting his head on David's lap. As the stars began to appear in the sky together, they had turned pain into purpose, proving that even in the darkest moments there was always hope. Ranger's story is a powerful reminder of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, despite everything he endured. Ranger fought to survive, and together with DAV, they uncovered the truth and brought justice to light. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel. Like this video and share it with someone who loves inspiring tales of hope and courage. Help us continue to spread awareness about animal welfare and the incredible strength of the human-animal bond. Thank you for watching.